So let's get started with our statistics project. But before that, I would like you to meet my friend Louis. Now, Louis stays in Toronto and he owns a candies store. And Louis is going to help us to learn more about statistics. The first topic that we want to learn is called as central tendency. So central tendency is like a big chapter, but don't worry, I will make it very simple for you. The first thing that we want to study is how we can calculate a mean. Now mean is nothing, it's just a glorified word for average. So let us try and study a little bit more about these concepts. Now since Louis stays in Toronto, Louis wants to count the number of cars in Toronto. So this kind of data is called as your population data. Now this kind of data is called as population because our entire scope of data is just Toronto, right? We only want to count the number of cars which are there in Toronto. So this number of cars is going to be a finite number and our scope or our range of data is limited just to Toronto. That's why this kind of data is called as your population data. Now let us see next what's going to happen. So next, Louis wants to count the number of cars in Toronto, but this time the data is different. Louis wants to count the number of cars in Toronto out of all of the cars in Canada. So this time what is happening is the number of cars in Toronto becomes your sample data. Now the reason why this data becomes sample data is we are taking a small subset of cars in Toronto from a bigger set of data, which is all of the cars in Canada. So all of the cars in Canada is your population, and since we are taking a small subset of cars just in Toronto, that's why this kind of data becomes your sample data. So let us have a look at one more example. For example, Louis wants to calculate the average height of people in his house. So for example, if there are 4 people staying in his house, then that data becomes the population data. Now what's happening in this case is the number of people are just limited to the house of Louis. And that's why the data is your population data and we are trying to calculate the average height. That's why we simply have to calculate the population mean for this kind of data. The next is Louis wants to calculate the average height of people in Toronto out of all of the people in Canada. Now what's happening in this case, all of the people in Canada, this data is your population data, and what we are targeting is we are targeting just the people who stay in Toronto. So this data is your sample data. That's why this average is going to be your sample mean, right? Let's have a look at one more example. Now Louis owns a candies store in Toronto and Louis wants to calculate the average number of candies sold in 3 hours. Now what kind of a data would this be? Would this be a population data or would this be a sample data? The answer is this is going to be a population data because our scope is just limited to 3 hours. And since this is a population data, we would be calculating the population mean. So for example, these are the different candies which are sold by Louis. In the first hour, Louis could sell 10 candies. For the second hour, Louis sold 20 candies. And for the third hour, Louis sold 30 candies. So let us see how we can calculate the mean for this kind of data. So we have to just add all of the candies together. So that's what we are doing right over here. And then we simply have to divide by 3. So we get the answer as 20 candies for an hour. That means Louis was able to sell on an average 20 candies per hour for the first 3 hours. Now let us have a look at one more example. Now this time Louis wants to calculate the average candies sold in the first 3 hours out of the entire day. Now in this case the full day would be your population data, and since we are just limited to the first 3 hours out of the full day, That means this is going to be our sample data, which means we have to calculate the sample mean. Now these are the different candies which are sold by Lewis throughout 8 hours in the day. So for the first hour he sold 10 candies, for the second hour 20 candies, for the third hour 30 candies, and so on. So let us see how we can calculate the mean in this case. So again, everything remains the same. For the first 3 hours we have the same figures. So 10 candies for the first hour, 20 for the second, 30 for the next. So that's why we have 10 plus 20 plus 30, and the number of hours for which we are calculating is 3. That's why we have 3 over here, and again this evaluates to 20. That means for the first 3 hours in the entire day, Lewis was able to sell 20 candies in an hour. So you can see that the formula for the mean remains the same. So what's the difference? The difference is in perspective. Sample data is different and population data is different. So keep this perspective in your mind, and let us see how we can code this population and sample mean right in the next video.